Hello, and welcome once again to a rather horrific heretical version of Inside the World of Mack's Headroom. Um, Today, I want to talk about a documentary as a foundation for talking about some other things that have to do with organized pedophilia. And the name of the documentary is called Chickenhawk. It's available on YouTube. All you got to do is put in Chickenhawk the movie into the search bar, and you can watch this wonderful piece of disgusting shit. But nonetheless, I want to comment on it today, especially in relationship to some of the dynamics of sex offenders and pedophiles. Uh, First of all, I thought I would just tell you a little story to get you warmed up. I was having a chat with one of my subscribers on the Discord, and this person is a nurse and had worked for a couple of years in a adolescent residential treatment center for sex offenders. And I recommended this movie to her, and she contacted me back. And the quote that she said to me, I think, is quite profound, because what she said was, this is worse than any horror movie I've ever seen. And it's definitely not like a horror movie, in the traditional sense with blood and gore and guts and stuff, but it's absolutely disgusting. And but it does illustrate, almost in an exaggerated fashion, the inner workings of organized pedophilia, especially in relationship to a group called NAMBLA, which stands for the North American Man-Boy Love Association, which is one of the old school organized pedophilia outfits that politically lobbies for man-boy love. And interestingly, just to explain a couple of things, one of the card-carrying members is actually Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet. And interestingly, again, sometimes poets get some sort of literary license to talk all kinds of shit. But Allen Ginsberg's, one of his famous poems is called Boy. And it starts out by like, I stuck my tongue deep into his mouth and tasted his saliva. It was like golden in my tongue. I mean, that's like this poem from this famous dude from the Beat era, who also is a card-carrying member of NAMBLA. And the interesting thing I think about this documentary is that, many, especially ever since the Jeff Epstein thing and Ghislaine Maxwell and also Jimmy Savile, excuse me, speaks to this organized pedophilia as if it's only an elite sort of outfit. And the thing that's interesting about Chickenhawk and NAMBLA, probably in general, is that these are basically like kind of working class pedophiles. They're not particularly wealthy. They're not particularly powerful. They're just ordinary, plain old perverts. Or to put it in politically correct language, homosexual pedophiles. They're pedophiles that like boys. Okay? And it's interesting because it's not about this ruling class kind of thing. It shows you that there's an organization living alive and well here in the United States, I think is the headquarters, of a group of organized pedophiles that are, again, I said, trying to lobby for acceptance or inclusion, to use a hip word, into the normal range of sexuality, like the sexual preference kind of thing. They've tried to get into LGBTQ. They got the shit beat out of them at the rally many years ago. This movie's from 1994, I believe. But the thing that I find most interesting about Chickenhawk is that, oh, by the way, a Chickenhawk is like a slang word for a pedophile. Just thought I'd clarify that. Just like there's another expression, there's another great movie too called Short Eyes. And a short eyes is also another slang word for a pedophile. So anyway, this documentary is called Chickenhawk. And there's so many things that I could go on discussing about this documentary that I have to sort of narrow it down to a specific area of inquiry. But the movie's not for the weak-hearted. So I guess I should give you one of those, trigger warnings or whatever if you're going to watch it, because it's really absolutely disgusting. There's no, sexual scenes or anything like that. It's just dialogues. It's a documentary that interviews a number of people that are avid members of NAMBLA, and they discuss their philosophy and a number of other things about the life of pedophilia and how misunderstood they are. As you all know, like MAPS and all those people are saying they're misunderstood and discriminated against and stuff. But this one, this movie or documentary is really very vivid and really explains, from my point of view, the most salient part of the movie is what is called the use of cognitive distortions, or sometimes they're called thinking errors. These are terms that come out of cognitive behavioral treatment of sex offenders. That's what strikes me the most out of this movie, is how pedophiles use cognitive distortions and thinking errors to prime their pump and give themselves permission to do really hideous things to kids. I should probably explain a little bit about what a cognitive distortion is for those of you that don't know. It's a way we all use cognitive distortions, by the way. It's just that pedophiles are really very colorful in their use of cognitive distortions. But basically, a cognitive distortion is any way that you either talk yourself or you talk other people into accepting something which you know down deep is wrong. I mean, to use a very simple example, if you if you like chocolate chip cookies but you're on a diet and you say one won't hurt, and you keep kind of repeating that, so, it's just one, what the hell? You don't connect the fact that one never ends with one. The more you can talk yourself into the idea that just one isn't going to hurt, the more apt you are to give yourself permission to do that. Okay, and the cognitive distortions that are used in this movie are so dramatic that you want to strangle these guys. Now, I'm not trying to preach a hate thing for pedophiles, really I'm not, but the movie is so vivid in how it talks about how these people talk to other people about pedophilia, and also how they refer to their own actions to themselves to justify or make excuses for what they're doing is absolutely incredible. Now, when you talk about, one thing that's really important to remember is we're not talking about delusional thinking. Now, some people might say that they are. So to those of you that believe that, okay, fine. But basically, a cognitive distortion is a way in which a person, not delusionally, but by self-deception and by deception to others, creates a mental environment in which it becomes okay to do outrageous things to kids. So, I want to be clear that what a cognitive distortion really is a means of lying. And I want to be blunt. As I mentioned before, I hate the word grooming. It's just too pretty. And, the same thing, cognitive distortion is another word, if you watch my last tape, that came out of academia. And so, again, it's got this pretty word, cognitive distortions. And they started calling it sometimes thinking errors. But really, I think of them as self-lies and lies to others, deception, self-deception. That's what it's really about. So I want to focus on that because there's just too much going on in this movie to actually break down in its entirety. But since the cognitive distortions and stuff are so flagrant, that I thought I would center on that just to kind of give you some insight into how these really hardcore pedophiles think about themselves, think about the boys they abuse, and how they present it to the world in a very crazy, insane, justified manner. Before I begin, I want to just share a little story about a client I had one time. Again, I guess I should repeat myself in case you've never seen my show before, but I'm a retired sex offender therapist. I ran a treatment program. It was my own program, blah, blah, blah. And I spent about 30 years doing it. So I published, I spoke at conferences and stuff. So I'm kind of aware of what this is about, but I always have a little bit of a heretical angle. I don't like to go along with the tide. And so I want to give you an example of one of the greatest forms of cognitive distortions, or self-lying, or lying to others to justify your behavior. Okay, this was a client of mine I had. He was a 70-year-old Christian Scientist, and he had intercourse with his 3-year-old granddaughter. And when he came in, he said, just to put it simply, he said to me, "Well, I never would have abused her. She wanted." He didn't use the word abuse. He said, "I never would have had sex with her, but she wanted it." Okay, that's the first distortion, right? I mean, that's called denial of responsibility. So he projects the responsibility onto a little 3-year-old, right, who has no idea what sexuality is. Give me a break, right? And he says, "I never would have done it if she didn't want me to." Well, that's just the beginning. He then went on to explain how to convince me of how badly she wanted to do it. He said, this is a 3-year-old he's talking about, and he's 70 years old. It's his granddaughter, right? He says, "Well, I mean, what would you do if you saw a 3-year-old looking at you flirtatiously and pulling down her pants and beginning to masturbate? And then, to even show you how badly she wanted it, she even took a chair and wedged it against the door so that nobody could come in, so we could have our private moments." This guy's 70 years old. He's talking about his 3-year-old granddaughter, okay? You can see how full of shit that line of logic is, right? But as long as he can talk himself into that, and I think more so in this case, try to talk me into it, the less he has to deal with his own problem, i.e. very bad pedophilia, prepubescent, 3 years old this kid was. And in this movie, it centers around two main characters. Their names, one guy's name is Leland, and the other guy's name I can't remember. And there's a bunch of other guys too. But the things I want to highlight, the things that they say to themselves and to others to justify their deviant actions, because it's just really unbelievable. Let me start with one. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of them. Let me start with one that's in the movie. This is a man who just got out of jail and had decided that he had to avoid children, okay? And he didn't want to sexually abuse anymore, right? So what do you think this guy does? He finds an apartment with a balcony facing the playground of a high school. And he stares out the window, okay? Now, what do you think the cognitive distortion is that he uses to explain what this experience is like? He says, quote, "Looking over my balcony into the playground of the high school is like Moses looking over to the promised land." Little strange, huh? And he really was emphatic about it. Now, was he delusional? No, I don't think so. I just think he was deceitful to himself and to the interviewer in the movie. It was like Moses looking over to the promised land. But that's an example of how these people represent themselves to others. Okay, let me go on for a while because I got a bunch of these. And like I said, I just want to center around this notion of how these people think, just to give you an idea of how twisted it is, really. Another one was boys want to do it, and they do what they want to do because they're boys. And as long as it's tender and warm-hearted. Okay? Another one that was really beautiful, I thought, here was this guy described oral sex with a prepubescent victim, okay, as a religious and spiritual experience. However, in the middle, as he's describing how glorious and wonderful, this experience was, he had to mention, and I want to use the words just as he said it. He said, not only was this spiritually and religious and enlightening, but I had one glorious ejaculation at the end. And he used that exact language. He didn't say orgasm. He didn't say I came. He said an ejaculation. What does that indicate? That means, you know, he came in the kid's mouth. That's what it seems like to me. Sorry if I'm vulgar, but that's how he transmuted for himself and for the other people, turning it into a religious, you know, sounds like a guy who just took DMT or something, you know? But having oral sex with this prepubescent kid was religiously beautiful, but then describes how he had this wonderful and glorious ejaculation at the end. The same guy was talking about another victim of his, and he said that he was in a park. These guys go to parks and shit. I mean, you know, this isn't like some folklore that your mom made you scared of. I mean, this is really true. He goes to parks and stuff. And he said one day he was sitting there, and there were two boys with their parents, right? With their parents present, okay? And he says that the boys flirtatiously were making excuses, and he could tell that they were making excuses by some, I don't know, you know, ESP thing. That they were flirtatiously making excuses to pull up his shirt in a flagrantly obvious and glorious way. Sorry. But get inside this guy's head and think about how he might be thinking about your kid when you're at the beach and he's sitting there watching, okay? I mean, you know, obviously these kids just pulled up their shirt because for whatever reason. They're kids. You know, their parents are right there. But he just described it as flagrantly obvious and glorious. Oh, okay. Another guy, when describing a sexual experience upon orgasming, he said, I bathed him in ancestral warmth. I mean, come on. But I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. Maybe I am a little bit. But I mean, you have to realize there's people walking around the world thinking this shit to themselves. Okay? You know, interesting, I should mention also in the beginning of the movie, a guy that I actually was jogging on a treadmill one day next to was a real famous guy when I was at a conference speaking. His name is Robert Longo Freeman. At the beginning, they quote him, and he says, there is absolutely no way to determine the percentage of people in the world that are pedophiles. So what he was saying was there's a shitload of them around, and don't kid yourself. Okay? And they think this crazy-ass way. Let's see. Oh, here was a great one. This boy, this man whose name is Leland. If you see the movie, he's wearing a white, like, cable sweater a lot. He had engaged a family into allowing him to take their son on a camping trip. Now, he describes this as noticing, because he's tuned in, you know, to children like nobody else is, right? I mean, you know, he has this special ability to translate what their behaviors are in some crazy, kooky way. He said he could tell that this boy, I think his name was Mike, wanted to share his life with me. He was looking for an adult figure to attach himself to. So they went on a camping trip. And during the camping trip, he says that, and he makes a real big point about this. He says, at Mike's initiation, which again is what we would call denial of responsibility, it's lying to yourself and projecting your own wishes on the boy so it's not your fault. You follow? We went on a camping trip, and he arranged the sleeping bags together in such a way as to, he says that the boy, okay, wanted to zip the two sleeping bags together so they could sleep in the same sleeping bag. And then he positioned himself in such a way as to experience what he wanted to experience. In other words, anal sex. Okay? They were like, you know, spooning. Let's go on. Oh, this one's beautiful. This guy says, you are a coward if you don't have a belief worth dying for. Now, what does that tell you about the compulsivity of a pedophile? I mean, it explains, you know, the way that they're thinking. If you don't, you are a coward if you don't have a belief worth dying for. I mean, you know, he sounds like, I don't know, the Civil War or something like that, you know? Oh, and another guy said, oh, this one's really great. He said, the interviewer said, well, I understand you went to jail. He says, yeah, I did go to jail, but it was kind of weird how I went. Well, how's that? He says, well, in order to prevent myself from abusing boys, I had to turn to peeping Tomism, voyeurism. And he got arrested window peeping. Well, one thing I've mentioned in other tapes about window peeping, exhibitionism, and frauteurism is that there's a statistical relationship between anybody who demonstrates those symptoms and what's called preferential rape, which means your most preferred way of having sex is by rape, by force. So here's a guy who says, you know, I'm so noble, basically, that I'm getting stymied here. You know, that he had to actually turn to another deviant behavior in order to not offend kids. I mean, that's crazy. Those behaviors often run concurrently. They're not mutually exclusive. They're mutually inclusive. So people that are abusing kids are also window peeping, sometimes on adults as well. But he had to actually say, like, to minimize, you know, the fact that he's just an outright pedophile. He said that he had to become a peeping Tom in order to not abuse kids, and that's the reason he went to jail. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. It probably is, but just think about the thought process that this guy deceives himself and tries to deceive others as to the motivation of their deviant actions. It's absolutely crazy. Excuse me. And finally, the last one at the very end of the movie is really, really freaky. He said, this guy, Leland, says, in a real eerie way, he says, all I have to say to the public is your days are over. All I have to say to the public is your days are over. In other words, pedophilia is going to be accepted, and you just might as well give up. And again, these are all from like working class pedophiles. This is not an elitist organization, although I mean some may be a member of the elites. I don't know that you can call Allen Ginsberg a member of the elites. He was just an offbeat, kooky poet in the Beat era that caught on to people who liked the self-expression and freedom of speech that was contained in his crazy poems. He's famous, this dude, Allen Ginsberg. So, I mean, that's the kind of thinking that goes on in the mind of a pedophile. And also in relationship to NAMBLA, those cognitive distortions become political, because what they're trying to do is then force those beliefs on the general public. And as I mentioned before, they go to this great gay pride rally. This is like before there was LGBTQ. It was like just, I think, you know, gay and lesbian. And they show up at this place, and they're holding banners and stuff. And you know, basically, you know, there's a cut version of this movie, and then there's like a director's copy. I've seen both of them. But in the director's copy, they get the shit kicked out of them by these buff gay guys. You know, so that is the way that these people think. And you know, I think if you've ever made an excuse to yourself, or if you ever lied to yourself, you know, trying to quit smoking, and you say, oh, one cigarette ain't going to hurt, then I mean, at least you can understand the thought process that goes on in these guys' mind. There's a couple of other things I wanted to mention, although I don't want to come across real strong on this, but there's one example in the movie where there's another guy who is an Italian teacher. Interesting, right? A teacher. And oh, this guy is like so poetic, it's like makes me want to vomit. But during the while they're exploring his life, a couple of things happen that I think are very interesting. First of all, he's got an old-fashioned answering machine, and it says something like, this is so and so from NAMBLA, and you must free yourself from these bonds, and blah blah blah, and please call me, and we can interact and try to make this right and make sense out of it. It's just all on a tape recording that's when his phone rings, right? Well, first of all, there's a guy who starts to like haunt him and say the most vile things to him, like, I'm gonna come and kill your fucking pedophile dick, and I'm gonna cut it off, and you motherfucking piece of shit. I mean, it's scary. If I heard somebody leave a message like that on my machine, oh my God, I'd be totally freaked out. But the point of the matter is that this guy, when the interviewer says to him, what do you think about that? Listen to the recordings you're getting. He goes, doesn't matter. They just don't understand. It's, it's full of shit. Another thing that happens to this man that I think is interesting, it's just a sideline, is that you'll see, if you watch carefully, when he's leaving, there's a scene where he's walking down his hallway, and you'll see that, oh, by the way, I believe his landlord is a pedophile also. Isn't that interesting? But I don't think everybody in the building's a pedophile. It's just that his landlord, I believe, is. And as he walks by, you'll see very quickly that there's actually a community notification poster that's in his hallway, and it's got his name, his picture, and it says, a pedophile lives here, keep your children away, blah, 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 blah. And all he does is just like disregard it. Well, the point I'm trying to make is not whether community notification, separate from the use of the registry. That's a whole different thing. This was an older school philosophy that the community needs to be notified by putting up signs and stuff when a pedophile's in the neighborhood, in order to create what's called external controls. So it's harder to do what you want to do because everybody knows what you are. This guy just shined on the whole thing. He just went, they don't understand. So, I mean, there's a couple of examples of, how not only they use cognitive distortions, but they're relatively unaffected by, one, a horrendously vulgar phone call that I'd be scared to death if somebody called me about that. And the other one was the fact that community notification, which is a really strong intervention, man, to put signs in front of your house. I mean, I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying that it's been frowned upon in terms of people's civil liberties by a lot of groups that aren't pedophilic in nature at all. They just say you just can't do that kind of shit. Matter of fact, when I was into the real hardcore treatment of pedophiles, we used to have our guys do what's called the walk of shame. And that meant that they had to go to all their neighbors and tell them who they were, tell them what happened, and tell them to keep their kids away. And then again, it's designed to create an external control so that the community becomes almost like an intervention, because it makes it harder, to do it when everybody knows what you're about. Did it affect this guy? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Did the murder threat stop him? He laughed at it. So, what I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, except I think that these guys are so unbelievably driven to deviant sexuality that they are very relatively unaffected by these very strong interventions that have even drawn public criticism because they say they violate civil rights. So, I guess in concluding, there's one other thing I got to share with you. There is an example. It's disgusting. He walks up to some boys that are playing a prank on an old-fashioned payphone where they figure out how to get the phone to call them back. Okay? I mean, it's a matter of like dialing 606 and then dialing the number that you're at. And then it's like a little game kids play, And the phone rings. Well, he notices this. It's right in the middle of like it's right at the side of a convenient mart, okay? And he walks up to these kids and he goes, "Hey, what's going on?" And blah, blah, blah. And they show him and he says, "Well, how do you do that? Show me how you do that." And the kid shows them and they laugh. And And before you know it, he's kind of trailing these kids. But they seem to walk away. Probably they know what's going on, and he splits. But when the interviewer is interviewing him in the car ride home, he says things like this: "Couldn't you tell the flirtatiousness of that child and how interested he was in me as an adult figure? Can't you tell how children are so driven, as well as he is, to have sex with, in this case, a man, because it's a homosexual pedophile thing, right?" Um, that he describes that he breaks it down. Didn't you notice the way he moved? He blinked his eyes. Didn't you notice the way he moved toward me when I asked how to do it? I mean, just simple bullshit things like that. And this guy is actually describing his grooming, or I hate that word. You all know that. Let's say his way of luring this kid into a potentially sexually abusive experience. But yet he describes it again by reversing the responsibility onto the kid and calling the kid flirtatious, and saying, couldn't you see the way he wanted to connect with an adult? It's absolutely crazy. So, if there's any moral or anything to this, I'm going to give a plug for the use of anti-androgen agents. I spent so many years doing hardcore cognitive behavioral sex offender treatment, and I took it to the hilt. I did stuff with my sex offenders that a lot of sex offender therapists didn't like doing. And maybe someday I'll make a tape of those kind of treatment exercises. But I'll tell you something. Nothing works as good as anti-androgen agents. Depo-Provera, as it's called. Chemical castration, whatever you want to call it. In all my years of treating sex offenders, the guys that got the best break were the ones that took anti-androgen agents, because what anti-androgen agents do is they block the flow of testosterone, which is like the sexual chemical that men have to create, sexual arousal, sexual interest. Once you get a guy on the right dose of anti-androgen agents, they have no sex drive at all. None. They don't think about sex. They don't fantasize about sex. I mean, they're like a little bit like a eunuch in a way. Yes, it only works for about a month until they need another shot. And yes, it's dependent on selling the offender on the fact that he needs to be on this medication perhaps for the rest of his life. But after showing you all these ways that these guys deceive themselves and deceive others, and to know that they're just roaming, they're not just in Hollywood. You know what I mean? They're not just in England. They're not just part of Epstein's Island. These are just like regular guys, except they're horrendously deviant. But, I hope that I could, explain that I really believe that the use of anti-androgen agents, as much as they have bad press and this and that, I already did a tape on chemical castration if you want to learn more about it. It's in my library. But I think that's one of the most reasonable ways to treat this problem, because just look at how driven these folks are. I mean, I remember I used to sit in sex offender groups, and at times, if you distanced yourself a little bit and just thought about it like they were talking like normal guys about women, it was like locker room talk. And these guys were like, almost appeared to me sometimes to be like, very sexual beings. But they're hypersexual. They're driven. It's like an obsession. And all of these cognitive distortions or self-deceptions that I laid out for you are also what makes it so possible for them to do it. And especially to enter it into the political arena, such as NAMBLA, who is trying to, create legislation to make people understand that this is just a normal unfolding of an adolescent child. It's really crazy. If you want to watch it, I'd highly suggest it if you have the stomach for it. As I said, my subscriber said, and I got a feeling, I don't know her very well, but I got a feeling that she maybe watches horror movies, and she said this was like worse than any horror movie I've ever seen. I've seen a Serbian film, which a lot of people say, oh my God, you get PTSD from it and stuff. That was so theatrical, it didn't faze me at all. Yeah, it's disgusting and sick, but I mean, it was so unrealistic. But this is the real McCoy. in the movie Chickenhawk. And again, it's available on YouTube. You just put in Chickenhawk the movie, and you'll be able to see it. And I think to witness it, rather than me describing it, it will be a profound experience just to know how really you got to keep an eye on your kids. And I mean, I know you all know that, but watching this and thinking about the crazy thought patterns that these guys have will definitely, I think, serve a harm reduction purpose, because it'll just illuminate how driven and, you know, whacked out these guys are, and how they are able to not only deceive society, but deceive themselves as well. And I think that's about it. I'm going to go throw up. So thank you once again for being with me in another disgusting, fun-filled episode of Inside the World of Mack's Headroom. Oh my God, I'm glad it's done.